Hi again. I'm about to start part 4 of the Paradigm Shifters Bookclub on this book, Inflamed by Rupa, Marya and Patel. It is a freezing cold day, believe it or not, here in the subtropics of Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, Australia. But cold as it is, I'm going to try not to freeze to the spot and launch. And I'm going to call this episode How to De-Inflame the World. In this video, I want to dive real deep into what I think are the incredibly far-reaching and societally transformative, and I mean massively transformative, implications that spring naturally from the amazing information in this book. What can we all do to de-inflame our lives and to de-inflame our world? Good news. We can do a lot. In our personal lives, there's a lot we can do to shield ourselves and our families from the inflammatory effects of modern living and potentially stave off inflammatory disease before it even starts. But it gets quite a bit more exciting still. There are so many initiatives that we can all take, if you care about this kind of thing, to force governments and businesses to terminate practices that are destroying human health and to replace them with regenerative, life-affirming alternatives that already exist and have already been proven very successful. Now, if you watched parts 1 and 2 and 3, you'll know that all of the causes of chronic inflammatory disease, our biggest killer and a crippling cost to health budgets, have one thing in common. They are mostly caused by environmental factors that are entirely remediable. So guess what? It's well within our grasp to nip inflammatory disease before it buds. Imagine stopping a huge proportion of inflammatory diseases like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, depression before they start. Imagine the enormity of the suffering that doesn't need to exist, and the many millions of lives that don't have to be lost, the millions of families that won't be scarred by illness, pain, disability, and bereavement. The whole shebang is nowhere near as inevitable as we've been led to believe. We're not fish in a barrel waiting to see who gets picked off by the disease gun. We're not doomed by our genes, and illness is not an unlucky spin of a roulette. The evidence is rock solid. We can relieve vast amounts of human suffering before it begins and make ourselves a lot less dependent on cures, drugs and surgeries. And the best way to slash those huge national health budgets that everyone's so worried about is at the very source. Reduce the need. Another way to say the same thing is stop inflaming our populations. Now, what can we imagine here? To be clear, these authors are not suggesting that inflammatory diseases like cancer, diabetes, autoimmune, heart disease, etc., can be eliminated altogether. But how far might we go? And we can't know until we start getting serious about prevention. Conventional sciences make this very clear. We can be confident that if we get rid of the unnecessary environmental aggravators, the incidence of chronic inflammatory disease across all categories will fall off a cliff. Now, does prevention cost money? You'd have to be kidding. National health budgets are stretched to screaming point. Insurance premiums are paralyzing. Productivity is bleeding. In the USA, people are being bankrupted by their medical bills. Preventive strategies would bring enormous budgetary relief, far in excess of any investment. So prevention is the low-hanging fruit. One more thing to clarify before I go on is that in calling for a ramp up of preventive strategies, the authors of this book are not mounting an argument against particular pharmaceuticals or surgeries. That's not their point. What they are saying is, why are so many of us getting so sick in the first place? Why is chronic disease growing out of control? And they're presenting the obvious implications that arise from the conventional science of inflammation. They demonstrate that diverting resources towards preventive strategies is a matter of good policy and social justice. Because by the time inflammatory disease takes hold, we have already left injustices unattended far too long, and we're acting too late. Chronic disease is systematically created by structural inequalities and an absence of checks and balances, an absence of proper regulation. And the smoking gun is, too often, some kind of power abuse, some kind of structural violence, some version of colonialization, which includes commercial agendas that violate the public good. And I have to say, I love these authors' sense of urgency. Now, in this video and the next video, I will be venturing beyond what the authors here talk about, but I do hope that the projections and forecasts that I interpret from this book will do justice to their work. And as before, I take responsibility for my own conclusions and extensions, which will be based on my own professional area as a psychologist and researcher into childhood development. So, let's go ahead and look at 8 major causes of chronic inflammatory disease. I'm going to call them the big inflammators. And as we go through one by one, let's look at what we can all do to mitigate them. Now, I won't be listing these causes in order of their importance because there is no hierarchy. I'm just going to follow the same order that I presented in part 3 of this series. Some of what I'm about to talk to you about, you will probably already know. Some of it might surprise you. And some of this info I actually found eye-popping. So, let's go. Let's dive in. Now, the first and second big inflammators, and you might recall we discussed those in part 3, involve the crisis of our dying soils and the saturation of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides in our industrial agriculture. Now, those twin aggravators disappear once we incentivize an accelerated transition to regenerative agriculture. If you're not familiar with the new science of regenerative agriculture, or Regen Ag, you're bound to hear about it more and more because it is so revolutionary, so successful, and it's spreading incredibly fast in every continent around the world. Regen Ag is a new scientific approach to food production that completely overturns traditional paradigms. It does away with those chemicals altogether. It actually rebuilds the soil profiles and regenerates the microbial diversity in the soil, while at the same time improving yields for farmers. Now, the farmers save a ton of money by no longer buying expensive chemicals, so they make high profits. And I think you'd be blown away by how quickly the new science and practice of Regen Ag is spreading around the world. With so many wins for farmers and for health and for the environment, it might sound too good to be true. So do a little bit of an internet search on regenerative agriculture, and I think you're going to be amazed. So to remove toxic chemicals from soil and food is to remove some of the biggest pressures on our immune health and inflammation. And as we regenerate our soils with a greater biodiversity of microorganisms and mycelia, this gives superior concentrations of nutrients in the produce, equals a massive collective boost to human health. It really works. There's no real reason for conventional, in other words, degenerative agriculture to persist other than big agribusiness and big chemical interests protecting their profits. So we can take a major leap forward in our family's health by doing everything we can to source our food from organic or regeneratively farmed sources. Please think about that because it's getting easier and more abundant. But the fact that regeneratively grown food is not the default mode available and affordable for everyone, despite all of our current know-how, well, that shows an embarrassingly large gap between knowledge and practice. And what's getting in the way of the obvious transition? What's your best guess? This is a perfect example of an issue that needs government regulation to incentivize large-scale conversion to regenerative until that becomes the new normal. And if today's sterile soils emergency and inflammatory disease epidemic don't warrant a radical intervention, I don't know what does. Does government regulation work? You betcha. In Australia, for example, strict bans on tobacco advertising and a heavy tobacco tax saved thousands and thousands of lives. Yes, it does work, and it works exceedingly well. But it's important to get that all of that came as a result of public pressure. In other words, we can't sit around and wait passively hoping that governments will act. It's up to us to be vocal. For now, not everyone can access regen produce, and there are great inequities there. That's where government has to step in and pull regulatory levers in favour of anti-inflammatory and regenerative means of food production. The free market is not going to make the needed changes voluntarily. If there's a social activist in you, whether you write letters, sign petitions, consumer activism, whatever your style, this is really one of the more world-changing causes. Okay, so on to the big inflammator number 3, antibiotics and their massive overuse. What can we do about that? Well, I think the first obvious thing to do is to scale down and eventually end the massively unhealthy practice of intensive factory-style farming of animals and birds, including fish farms. These are endless incubators of disease like bird flu. The animals only survive the infernal, unsanitary and unecological conditions thanks to being pumped full of antibiotics, which then come to us, the next creature in this adulterated food chain. Again, those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to take personal responsibility can protect ourselves by either electing to go vegan or by eating organic, wild-caught, free-range and regeneratively farmed protein as a matter of commitment. But this shouldn't be a luxury or a privilege, and as before, it won't be the norm unless we can pressure governments harder than the pressure that they get from corporate vested interests. And that is another great cause for activism. As for the overuse of antibiotics in medicine, anecdotally, I'm pleased to have observed a growing conservatism among some doctors certainly more caution when prescribing. Now, there's more than can be said about that subject that my expertise doesn't extend to. But do we always need to use antibiotics when infected? How else can we support our body's immune response? No definitive answer from me right now, but those are definitely questions to continue exploring more deeply. And yes, there is room for personal choice, judiciously and with expert help, which includes following up with prebiotics and probiotics if you've had to take a course of antibiotics. You can take charge. You can take charge a lot. Talk with a nutrition specialist, and remember, the optimal firepower of your natural immune response happens when your gut is not inflamed, which means a high diversity and good balance of the healthy, friendly gut bacteria. Now this leads us naturally to the big inflammator number 4, the modern diet. Now on this subject, your best bet is to consult with a clinical nutritionist. They are far more knowledgeable about diets than GPs, and of course they know a megaton more than me. Now, what's the most gut restorative, non-inflammatory, immune-powering diet? Well, that does vary from individual to individual, but there are some broad themes that get the most support from the research. And this puts the anti-inflammatory power right into your hands. So, here are the main takeaways from the anti-inflammatory diet literature. Actually, before I go on, I want to say that food should be a joy. It should be yummy. It should be exciting. I think diets that don't celebrate the sensuality of food are doomed to failure. A healthy diet based on deprivation and blandness is not a healthy diet, in my view. In fact, restrictiveness is unsustainable. There are surveys from around the world that show the rate of commitment to a restrictive diet is vanishingly low, and I think for good reason. Health and pleasure go together. And the good news is that there is a world of absolute deliciousness inside the scope of anti-inflammatory food. Keep that in mind so that we can look at how to take the inflammation out of our meals painlessly. Here are some key points. As far as your gut bacterial balance goes, the more diverse your diet, the better. So it's important not to get too stuck on staple foods. Mix it up a little. Play the field. The friendly gut bacteria species all have different appetites. The more the merrier, so let's feed all of them. And apparently our bacterial buddies love this thing called fiber. A diet rich in fiber, and that means lots of fruits, veggies, legumes, nuts and seeds, is believed to save your gut from inflammation by helping the good gut bacteria to multiply. By now, you're likely to have heard the major inflammation-causing culprits are the processed foods, especially those containing artificial chemicals like colouring, flavourings, preservatives and such. Refined cane sugar, definitely one of the chief villains in the world of inflammation. You know, it's incredible to consider how addicted we've become to these entirely unnecessary little white crystals since the transatlantic sugar trade began in earnest in the 16th century. And now you can barely find a packaged food that isn't loaded with it. Sugar is everywhere, and we seem to be hooked. And it is critically implicated in the epidemic of chronic disease, especially diabetes. Truth is, everything is much sweeter without sugar. And besides all that, avoiding refined carbohydrates, sticking to wholemeal grains can be a beautiful culinary adventure while protecting us further from inflammation. In broad terms, the Mediterranean and the Japanese diets repeatedly seem to top the charts in terms of offering the greatest shot at a low inflammation life. Changing our relationship to food is not always easy, especially when we and our kids are bombarded with ads and hyper availabilities of over-processed junk. And if we are surrounded by a culture that's addicted to inflammatory food, it's socially difficult to be the misfit or the lone wolf. Now here's a point well made by these authors. It's too easy to place all of the burden of self-control on individual responsibility while giant profit interests fund relentless campaigns to combat government regulation and to get people addicted to junk food. I think it's a bit rich to expect busy individuals to do all of the heavy lifting when big food rakes in astronomical profits while making millions of people miserably ill. And I agree when these authors assert that governments need to assume their share of responsibility. It would be the role of government to remove subsidies from processed foods and refined carbs, to ban the advertising of junk food, especially to children, to introduce taxes on added sugar, on colorings and other inflammatory chemicals, to improve truth of labeling, to require non-inflammatory standards in school food, and to mandate non-inflammatory meals in hospitals. Now, it shocks me to see, against all conventional science, how often hospital food includes the kind of stuff that can almost put you there in the first place. Now, the next one is one that really blew my mind. Until I read this book, I never realized what an enormous role air pollution plays in chronic inflammatory disease. So, the big inflammator number 5 is fossil fuel pollution. Burning fossil fuels is almost always associated with global heating and climate catastrophes, but what's really strange is that there's another huge problem that almost never gets talked about. Over 8 million people die every year as a result of air pollution caused by fossil fuels. 8 million. That would be like the entire population of Switzerland being poisoned to death every year. To get an idea of the scale, it's much more than all the deaths caused by the entire Russian-Ukrainian war. Now that's insane. Do you realize it's even worse than the COVID pandemic? And that's without even mentioning climate change. Compared to the international COVID response, the response to fossil fuel pollution, which is a much larger mass killer, it's been microscopic. Now, see if you can guess why that is. And the most outrageous thing is that fossil fuels are obsolete. Green energy technology has matured. It can well and truly meet all of our energy needs now. And it's already quite a bit cheaper and infinitely more abundant than fossil fuels. Several countries, including Norway, Costa Rica, Uruguay, already generate more than 90% of their national energy requirements through green renewables. And that list is growing quickly. There is a hell of a lot that we can do about this collectively. Those of us that have the means can obviously opt out of the fossil carousel with EV cars, solar panels, home batteries, etc. The rest of us can agitate for a full transition away from the carbon economy and carbon transport right now. clean renewables and storage together are already much cheaper, fully capable of powering all of our domestic and industrial needs and a great chunk of our transport needs. Even the most fanatic of climate deniers cannot argue with this fact. The first thing that we will see as we shift to 100% green energy is a steep plunge in the rates of inflammatory disease and related deaths. And in fact, it's already happening. The authors of this book provide evidence of cities that have already begun to raise the life expectancy of their people after cleaning up their air pollution. Okay, so those were the main physical causes of chronic inflammation. In the next video, part 5, we're going to look at how our psychological environment can be just as much a cause of chronic inflammation, and what can we do individually, collectively, and politically to greatly ease the psychological inflammatory burden on our families, our communities, and our nations. So, stay tuned and see you at part 5. In the meantime, I want to ask your help. If you've enjoyed this video, please take a couple of seconds to hit the like button and subscribe. And share this video with friends. It's free and it will help me to sustain the making of these videos to share. Also, for a lot more paradigm shifting material, do check out my Substack, Psychology for Paradigm Shift. The address is below. And for now, adios.